Liz Gillis is a very well-known, accomplished author and historian. Today's talk is on the theme of women and their role in the 1916 Rising.
Everyone, I hope you can see me. I'm quite small and I tend to get lost behind podiums, so if you can't see me, maybe hopefully you'll be able to hear me. But I suppose just to explain, firstly, I'm not going to be able to give all the names because there's so many women involved in 1916 and beyond. What I hope to do is just highlight some of the bigger names, but more often the lesser well-known women, and to show that these women were vital to 1916 and beyond. Recently, people have been dismissive as the role that women did play in 1916, as in that they just made sandwiches for the men. But as I hope to show, they were nurturers, they were actually vital to what happened in the Rising, and they actually helped those men, push those men to continue and make sure that 1916 wasn't just a flash in the pan, it was the beginning of something that basically changed the whole history of this country. But when we look at 1916 or the Irish Revolution as a whole, one group that has to be mentioned and really is overlooked is Eilis Ni Riain, and that was set up in 1900 by Maude Gonne, and she's there in the centre holding the banner. Now Maude Gonne herself, she had a long connection with Irish republicanism. Eilis Ni Riain is a Dublin based organisation, but it crosses the class divide because you've got women like Maude Gonne, Helena Maloney, Countess Markievicz is a member later on, who come from very privileged backgrounds but working alongside women like Elizabeth O'Farrell and Julia Grenn and so on, who are from Dublin's inner city. So it does cross that class divide because what these women have in common is basically independence for Ireland. They're not a nationalist group of women, these are Republican women, but also they have a social conscience. They're aware of what's going on in Dublin City. Now, if you think 1900, Dublin's the second city of the British Empire, but you go a block behind O'Connell Street, you're into the worst slums in Europe. There's kids dying, there's children, they are literally living way below the poverty line and they're slipping through the cracks. And no one seems to be doing anything for those kids because their future, it seems, isn't important. These women were. They saw that what were the future for these children, for the girls go into service, maybe get factory work, for the boys get some work, not guaranteed work on the docks, but more often than not go into the British Army to be cannon fodder. And these women wants to give those kids a chance, a future. And they set up schools, they set up a school in North Great Georgia Street, and you see that the boys are really their focus because they really want to give them a chance at life. And what they're doing is they're teaching the kids about their country, their history, stuff that wasn't being taught in a lot of schools. And they're teaching them to be proud of the country that they come from. Now, when you fast forward to 1909 and the Fianna Éireann is set up, co-founded by Countess Markievicz, a lot of the boys that they would have taught in those classes become members of the Fianna Éireann, and then they in turn teach these women how to shoot and drill and so on. So the student becomes the teacher. But then when the Irish Volunteers are set up in 1913, a lot of those boys become the officers in the Volunteers. And unfortunately, as the years come along with the War of Independence and the Civil War, sadly, a lot of those women have to bury those boys. But that's the relationship that started way back in 1900. But not only are they advocating an independent Irish Republic, these women they'd be early advocates of a Buy Irish campaign because they were encouraging their members to wear Irish products, so Irish trade, promote what we have, what we produce in this country. But also they're putting themselves in the firing line early on because they were out on O'Connell Street, walking up and down O'Connell Street handing out leaflets to girls who were going out with British soldiers. So they could have been attacked at any time, but these women are really deciding early on that if a republic does come, they know what they want that republic to be. It's not going to be just a change name in their eyes. They want to benefit those who need to benefit most, which is the people that don't have a voice, the ordinary people in this country. But the first 15 years of the 20th century, so much is happening so quickly. We have the Home Rule Bill being introduced in 1912, but of course there was no place for women in the Home Rule Bill. John Redmond, they're not interested in what women have to say. And on foot of the Home Rule Bill being put into statute books, you have the Ulster Volunteer Force being set up in Ulster. Now, what was happening up in Ulster, there was always eyes on down here, and it was decided then that an Irish volunteer force should be set up. So the Ulster Volunteer Force set up to ensure Home Rule won't be introduced. The Irish Volunteer Force set up to ensure Home Rule will be introduced. Now, in amongst this, there's another group, and that is the Irish Citizen Army. And the Irish Citizen Army, it really is a citizens' army, set up in the midst of the lockout in 1913. And there's no one to protect the workers that are out on strike. The police who should, they're siding with the employers. So there is no one to protect these men and these women who are being battened and charged, who are being killed. So a citizens' army is set up by James Larkin and James Connolly, and there's a women's section to the citizens' army. And the photograph just on the left there, that's a group of the veterans who fought in 16, men and women, outside the Shell Liberty Hall in 1917. But the Citizen Army women, they have a history with each other because they've been active. 1913 politicised a lot of women, but in the case of the Citizen Army women, they've been members of the Irish Women Workers Union, and you find there's a lot of close friendships there. But just like the Eilis Ni Riain women, the Citizen Army crosses that class divide, because again, you've got Helena Maloney, you've got Kathleen Lynn, Madeleine French Mullen, Nellie Gifford, coming again from very privileged backgrounds, but working alongside Molly O'Reilly and so on, Bridget Davis, so girls again from the city centre. But if you look at Eilis and you look at the Citizen Army, they're only Dublin-based organisations. And certainly with Eilis Ni Riain, it can only do so much if it's only based in Dublin. So with the arrival of the volunteers, it is decided that there should be a national women's organisation. So in April 1914, Cumann is set up in Wynn's Hotel. Now, Eilis did not go away. It actually becomes a branch of Cumann. And if you look at the way the volunteers are set up, you have a brigade broken down into battalions, broken down into companies, broken down to sections. Cumann, they were actually similar in that they had branches. So with the volunteers, you'd have ideally a branch of Cumann attached to a battalion of the volunteers. But these women would be neighbours of these men, it would be their brothers, and sometimes it would be their husbands. So there's very, very close connections there between the volunteers and Cumann. And initially when it was set up in Dublin, you have 3 branches of Cumann to 5 branches or battalions of the volunteers. And to break it down, you had the 1st and 2nd Battalion of the Volunteers on the north side of the city, 3rd and 4th on the south side, and the 5th are the Fingal. And if you think of O'Connell Street as the dividing line, so from O'Connell Street all the way out to Fairview and so on would be the 2nd Battalion area, and the Fairview Cumann branch were associated or attached to that battalion. And then you have the Central branch, which has a huge membership, but that was predominantly attached to the 1st Battalion, which would be O'Connell Street all the way out towards Carber, Phillipsborough, Phoenix Park and so on. There's only one branch on the south side, which is the Eilis branch, and they're spread over the 3rd and 4th. And if you look at, say, Patrick Street, Camden Street as the dividing line there, so from Camden Street down to Ringsend would be the 3rd Battalion, and then from Camden Street, Patrick Street out to Clondalkin would be the 4th. So in Eilis, probably about 80 women are spread over those 2 battalions. And just to show you the photograph there on your right, that is an unidentified group of Cumann who are in full uniform. The Citizen Army women didn't necessarily have a uniform unless you were an officer like Kathleen Lynn or Countess Markovich. But When we actually come to 1916, just in the lead up to it, you have the Hope gun running, where guns are brought from Germany by Erskine Childers and his wife, Molly, and also Mary Spring Rice. That actual idea was planted by Mary Spring Rice, because you had the Larkin gun running, where the Ulster Volunteer Force brought in the guns to Larkin. They were landed, there was no issue. However, when they tried to do it here, there is an issue. The military or the police don't want the volunteers to bring those arms in. But Mary Spring Rice, not only did she suggest that they should bring in the arms, she gave £2,000 her own money. She was a member of the Limerick Cumann, and she actually went on the expedition herself. And when you have the Bachelors Walk massacre, where the military opened fire on the civilians that day, on the 26th of July, it's Cumann that lead the funeral processions of those victims, of those civilians. And you find a lot of them wear a white ostrich feather in their hat. And this is actually a sign of cowardice to the authorities, and are very, very powerful images, because what these women are saying to the military is that you were cowards. You didn't fire on armed men, it was unarmed civilians, civilians that you are meant to protect. You actually opened fire and killed a number of them. But you see that the women are starting to train for what's going to come. And by the time we reach the Civil War, the women are so experienced in propaganda that they become such a threat to the new government, that they're arrested in their droves. But I'll touch a bit on that later on. But when we come to 1916, of course the date was 24th of April or 23rd of April, Easter Sunday. And just like the volunteers, where they had their points that they would mobilise, Cumann had to do the same. The exception is the Citizen Army, because James Connolly actually called everyone from the Citizen Army into Liberty Hall the week before, because there was the real threat that there was going to be mass arrests. So basically you've got safety in numbers, so everyone was called in. And they have this event on Palm Sunday, and you've got Molly O'Reilly, who was only a teenager at the time, and she's basically given the honour of hoisting the flag above Liberty Hall. But throughout that week, you've got the women, Kathleen Lynn and so on, and they're all prepared in the field dressings. They know something's going to come. They know they've been told it's manoeuvres, but they have to be ready in case it is something bigger, which it proves to be. So they're busy getting everything ready for the men for to come and fight. But on Easter Sunday, you have the women of the Central Branch, and by 1916 there was another branch set up on the north side of the city, and that was the Columkill branch. It was set up in 1915 at the request of a girl that was 16 years old at the time, Dolly O'Carroll, later Dolly Lawler, because she lived around Manor Street and Church Street, that area. And although you had a lot of women that were members of the Central Branch, they actually hadn't got representation in their own community. So she went to the Central Branch, the leaders there, and asked, could a new branch be set up, and they agreed. And so she is the reason that you have 4 branches in 1916, and Dolly herself took part in 1916. But on Easter Sunday, they mobilised. So some women of the Central and Columkill branches would mobilise at the Black Church, just up beyond Parnell Street there. You had the Citizen Army women ready to go at a moment's notice. The Anina women, half were to mobilise in Denora Avenue, and then the other half were to mobilise around Camden Street, because they were going to be with Eamon de Valera in Boland's Mills. But of course, with all McNeil's countermand in order, it changes everything. And the women are told, like the men who also mobilise at their positions, basically go home, but be ready to go with a moment's notice. Now, you find that the women are deliberately told not to be in uniform, and the reason for that was because of the type of work that they had to do. If they were in uniform, they'd be easy targets for the military. So the type of work they'd be doing would be dispatch carrying, bringing weapons and ammunition supplies to all different outposts, so they could easily go through if they're not in uniform. And that's why you only have the likes of Countess Markievicz and Kathleen Lynn actually in uniform in 1916. The women are waiting around just like the men. They're waiting at home, waiting for word to come, and then on Easter Monday, 24th of April, word finally comes that something is going on. Get ready to mobilise. So again, they meet at their points. The Citizen Army women are ready there from Liberty Hall, lined up with the men, ready to march off. Rose McNamara gathers for 25 women at Denora Avenue. They march off towards Cork Street. The other half of Nina are waiting in Camden Street for word to come. The word never ever comes for them to go to De Valera's command. But what you do find is that those women, when they realise something is going on, they actually make their way to whatever outpost they can get into. You had the women of the Fairview would be attached to Jacob's Biscuit Garrison, factory garrison, so they make their way to Stephen's Green, and then when you find out that they've taken over Jacob's, they make their way there. So you'd have like Morning Schulig and Kathleen Lynn and so on. And also you do have the likes of Leslie Price and Brid Dixon and Eilis Ni Riain, and they're waiting at Black Hall or the Black Church, and they are told, they get word from Ned Daly, who takes over the forecourt, that they have to go home, and they refuse. So they basically make their way to O'Connell Street to see where they can get in. Only one woman marches off from Liberty Hall to take over the GPO with the headquarters staff, and it's this lady here, Winnie Carney, a member of the Belfast Cumann, but she was actually requested by James Connolly to come down to Dublin to be with him, and she's a secretary. She is his right-hand man in the GPO. And if you look, what they say is when she marched off, she was armed with a typewriter in one hand and a revolver in the other, and that typewriter, she walked that typewriter for the whole week. But when you look at 1916 as the rising goes on, and James Connolly is giving orders for men to go out to the different outposts and come back with dispatches and so on, he tells them that if they can't get to him, they have to report back to Winnie Carney. Now, obviously the men are surprised at this. Sean Noonan was taken aback, and he questioned this, and Connolly's response was, treat her the way you treat me. So that's how highly he held these women. That's how high a regard he had for Winnie Carney. Other women do make their ways to GPO later on, the likes of Liz O'Farrell, Julia Brennan, Min Ryan and so on, because these women, they've been sent down to the country. With the countermanding order that is published in the newspapers, you've got women being sent all over the country, down to Wexford, down to Cork, Galway and so on, with word that the rising is going to happen. So as they come back, when they come back, the GPO has been taken over, but they do eventually make their way in and are there for the week. But in relation to some of the other outposts, the Citizen Army is split in two. So you have one half that go with Michael Mallon, take over Stephen's Green Park, and the other half they go with Captain Sean Connolly and take over City Hall. His sister Katie Barra and his two brothers George and Matty are actually in that garrison as well. So they've got one example of pretty much a whole family being involved. But in Stephen's Green, and Stephen's Green is a depot, that's why to take it over, because ideally if you had all the men, it would be easily accessible from all the major outposts. But of course we know they haven't got enough men to take over every building surrounding Stephen's Green. And pretty early on, the military surround, they take over the Shelbourne, set up a machine gun post there, also in University Church. And by Tuesday morning, the garrison that dug trenches in Stephen's Green, basically they wake up to the sound of machine gun fire, they're completely surrounded. But just some of the women that were members of that garrison, the lady there on your right is Mary Hyland, and she is one of the women that is actually sent from Stephen's Green in the first party to take over the College of Surgeons, because they know they're sitting ducks in Stephen's Green. So they run over and take over the safety, or those the safety of the College of Surgeons, but go in batches of 6 or 8 people, and she's one of the first to go. But the women were actually deliberately targeted by the soldiers because they're wearing their big heavy skirts. They were easy targets for the military, who were deliberately firing on them. Luckily enough, none of the women were actually injured while they were crossing over. You did have some Citizen Army men that were fatally wounded as they were making that journey. She later married Mick Kelly, who actually fought with her in the College of Surgeons. And then the lady in the centre is Nellie Gifford, and we know the Gifford sisters. You know, Grace Gifford, it is the love story in 1916, one of the events that helps change the minds of people. But the sister that is really active very early on is Nellie, and she is out in 1913. She's working in soup kitchens, very, very radical. And also, if you look in 1913, she's the one that smuggles James Larkin into the Imperial Hotel. And when the police get into the room, she's actually injured when they're trying to arrest him. She's responsible for getting Michael Collins the position of aide-de-camp to Joseph Plunkett when he comes over in January from London. So she is instrumental in all of this. And in the College of Surgeons, she is in charge of the kitchens there, because she was a domestic cookery skills teacher and so on, travelled around the country doing her day job, and then was part of a revolution as well. And they did what they could, because some garrisons had lots of food, as in Jacobs, as Liam O'Daly says, they had lots of biscuits there. Marylebone Lane, they robbed 2 cows, had 19 chickens, but there were some garrisons that the food was very, very low. And she did what she could. She fed the garrison, and some of them, you know, that's one thing when you find looking at the accounts, the men, all of them talk about food. It was so important to them, and this is why it's quite annoying when people are being dismissive about women making sandwiches for them. But those sandwiches were more important to the men than bullets in some cases, so it's very, very, very important. But Nellie was arrested after 1916, held in Cumann jail. Wasn't allowed to see her sister, wasn't allowed to be with her sister when she needs her most after she married Joseph Plunkett. And the sense of loss that she must have felt, because it's not only Joseph Plunkett that dies, she also has Thomas McDonagh, another brother-in-law. So you do find as the rising goes on, as the War of Independence and Civil War go on, the sense of loss these women feel, it is huge. And then Margaret Skinder on your left. Just to show one woman who actually did an awful lot more to make sandwiches. When they took over University Church, the military, there was a plan that the ICA would attack the Russell Hotel, which was on the corner of Harcourt Street. It's the big red brick building now right in the corner. The idea was attack that, spread a fire that would spread to the University Church, smoke out the military, and they would then evacuate, so take out that position. And she's chosen to be a part of that group of men. She's with William Partridge and Fred Ryan. But what they didn't know is that in number 6 Harcourt Street, the military had actually set up a post, and it's overlooking the Russell Hotel. So when they get to their position, and they had to smash open the doors with the rifle butts, but one of the guns goes off, and the British soldiers see the spark, they open fire, and she was shot 3 times, once in the spine. Fred Ryan was killed, he was only 18, and they managed to get her back to the safety of the College of Surgeons, but they didn't know if she was going to survive, because she was so severely wounded. She was delirious, and she recalls sort of having this out-of-body experience, because they're all panicking around her, and she thinks this is it, this is the end. But she did survive, spent 7 weeks in hospital. Fast forward to when the pensions are released, she was actually denied her pension because she didn't fit the criteria of the soldier, which was male, which unfortunately applies to a lot of the women later on. But there's just some examples of the tip of the iceberg for the Stephen's Green garrison. Then you have the women in City Hall. And when they marched off and went to City Hall, Captain Sean Connolly, who actually worked as a clerk in Dublin Corporation, so he knew the whole area. The policeman that shot, by Sean Connolly, he knew him. But just to say that Dublin Castle was actually never the target, because you had a Red Cross hospital set up there, and James Connolly knew that if they took over or attacked a Red Cross hospital, they were idealists, they were realists as well, but they knew how would that look on the world stage if they actually attacked the Red Cross hospital. So in James Connolly's words, it was never to be a target. Now, City Hall, they get in quickly. It's a garrison of possibly about 30 men and women. You've got 9 women there, including the Norgrove sisters, Rosie Hackett, Helena Maloney, and so on. Kathleen Lynn, she is sent to be with that garrison, but because she had a car on Easter Monday, she was delivering supplies to all the various outposts. So by the time that she gets to City Hall, they're in the building, they've locked the building, she has to climb over the railings to get in. There's 2 women that are promoted to the rank of officer pre-1916. Both Citizen Army women, and it's Countess Markovich and Kathleen Lynn. She's the Chief Medical Officer, she's a captain. But pretty early on, Within an hour of them taking over City Hall, Captain Sean Connolly was fatally wounded. Now the girl on your right, Bridget Davis, she was actually up on the roof of City Hall. He's hoisting the flag and a British sniper basically shot him in the head, and he died pretty much in minutes. But you have Bridget Davis beside him, Helena Maloney was there, his sister was there, and Kathleen Lynn was downstairs. And again, from the accounts, you got this sense of helplessness because there was nothing they could do to save him. Bridget Davis, our nurse's apron that she was wearing, she kept that for the rest of her life, never washed it. His bloodstains are still on that. It's actually in Cumann jail at the moment. But Helena Maloney says that they called for Kathleen Lynn, and all she could do was whisper an act of contrition in his ear, and he was gone. Now, his second in command, John O'Reilly, he was also fatally wounded. So when that garrison surrendered on Tuesday, it was actually led out by a woman, Kathleen Lynn. She was the next in line in seniority. But City Hall could have fallen a lot sooner. It actually could have been taken on one day, but due to the quick thinking of the women, that didn't happen. Because when the military were trying to get in, climbing through the windows and so on, the women who were on the upper floors, they started shouting across to each other. So making it look like there was 200 or 300 people in the building when you've got less than 30. But the military pulled back, and then it's not until Tuesday that garrison actually did surrender. And what that shows is the quick thinking, how the women could actually think on their feet. And again, it's like the women are training for what is to come. Now, they all marched out and they were taken to Ship Street Barracks and held in filthy conditions. And they were held there until the 30th of April, the Sunday that the surrender, all the garrisons have surrendered. And then they were brought up to Richmond Barracks, and then a day later they were brought to Cumann jail. And just to go beyond 1916, Kathleen Lynn sets up St Ultan's Hospital in 1918 with Madeline French Mullen and Kathleen Clarke and Anya Kent and all these women whose husbands had died. And St Ultan's is the first infant hospital in this country. Because again, no one cared about the kids dying in the street. These women did. And how many people, how many kids they actually saved. And she insists that all her nurses, who she fought with in the Citizen Army, they all get their nursing degrees, and they all went, predominantly most of them went and worked as nurses then in St Ultan's, and a lot of their daughters followed them into that profession as well. So it just shows that they were thinking beyond the revolution. So two women that we have here that refused to obey orders. You've got Leslie Price on the left and Eilis Ni Riain on the right. And they were two women that met at the Black Church and then made their way into the GPO. Now Leslie Price got into the GPO, Eilis Ni Riain was delayed, and by the time she got to the GPO, she was turned away. She was told that they had enough men or enough women in the GPO, so find her place to go, and she went across the road to Rhea's chambers. Now again, from the accounts of the women, Blimey O'Connor, when the girls knocked on the door to get into Rhea's, Blimey O'Connor, he was delighted to see them because he had eaten all his rations in the first few hours. And again, it's this whole thing of food, and she and her friends, I think it was Brid Lyons possibly, they were sent back over to the GPO to get food. But Desmond Fitzgerald, who was in charge of the kitchen in the GPO, he seemed to be very protective of the food, because he refused to give him any for the men. And she had to threaten to physically fight him to get the food. And then he agreed to give her they gave her some milk and a small portion of food. But when they got back, and they had to cross O'Connell Street under gunfire, they got back safely. And again, the men were just so thrilled because it was survival for them. They kept that garrison going. With Leslie Price, in the first couple of days, she's sent from outpost to outpost, from the GPO to the forecourts and back again. And if you look, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you've got more or less gunfire happening, there's gun battles, but the British can't get into the city centre because of all the other outposts that are stopping them from getting in. You've got Devil Air stopping them coming in from Dunleary. Eventually they do come in. They've got a massive battle at Mount Street Bridge. They can't get past Ned Daly's command in the forecourts. They can't get past Eamon Kent's position in the South Dublin Union. So it's only when you bring up the Helga, up the Liffey and start to shell the city that you have to really intensify fighting. And on Thursday, the GPO was being shelled. The city has fallen down around him, and James Connolly has been wounded severely. There's chaos in the GPO, volunteers are wounded left, right and centre. And Tom Clarke, who's sort of taking command now, he basically decides that although he doesn't agree with it, maybe a priest should be on hand to assist, tend to the men if this is their last few hours. And he asked Leslie Price to go. Now, as she says, she was terrified. And there wasn't a fly out on O'Connell Street, according to her. And she's fighting back to tears because she cannot cry in front of Tom Clarke. It is Tom Clarke. And she agrees to go. Now, she describes her journey, goes through Moore Street, makes her way in Parnell Street, and she's waiting at the foot of the statue of Parnell, waiting for the bullets to stop so she can dart across into Sean McDermott Street, down to Marlborough Street, and she gets to the priest's house. And when the priest opens the door, he starts to give out to her, saying that she's in a revolution, that's fine, she shouldn't be doing that, she's a young girl. But what really annoys the priest is that who she is with are a bunch of Reds and a bunch of socialists. It's James Connolly and so on. It's not the volunteers he has a problem with, it's the volunteers, the citizen army. Now, she gives as good as she gets because she starts to berate him. And as she says, no, she had confession, she was at peace with herself, but he was a priest, and it would do him good to do his job and tend to the men who might need solace. But she was going back one way or another, with or without him, she was going back. And he agrees to go back with her, and she gets him back safely. And as she says again, that she was just delighted to hand him over. As soon as she gets in, she just hands him over to whoever, and then she's done with him. But she was starving. And the thing is, in the officers' mess, you had to hold a rank to eat in the officers' mess in the GPO, and she's promoted in the field, so she could actually eat in the officers' mess. But if you look at what she does in the War of Independence, she sent down to Cork to organise Cumann down there. She had to have a line of communication from the GHQ in Cork up to GHQ in Dublin with all dispatches of operations and so on. And that meant women having girls on bicycles in villages all over, and they'd actually pass the messages to each other. They'd have to do this at night alone, could run into patrols of auxiliaries, military, and some of them often did. But that line of communication was never ever disrupted, they never discovered it. She meets Charlie Hurley, OC, the 3rd West Cork Brigade. Charlie Hurley is killed, she has to bury Charlie Hurley, and then she ends up marrying his best friend, Tom Barry, and she becomes Leslie Price de Barra. But she's just one example of similar stories of what was to come in the War of Independence and the Civil War. Eilis Ni Riain was sent to the Four Courts to help with Ned Daly's command there. And he had set up a headquarters in the Father Matthew Hall and moves to the Four Courts on the Friday. Whereas you've got women in the Four Courts, you've got a lot of women in the Father Matthew Hall because it is a first aid station. And again, you've got Eilis, her sister, and you've got the Elliott sisters, and you've got the Morpins and so on, the O'Sullivans. And again, it's the whole sense of helplessness that there's nothing that they can do to men who are dying. There's nothing they can help them with. It's just they can try and make them be as comfortable, give them as much comfort as possible in their last hours. But she isn't arrested, just like Leslie isn't arrested, because when the surrender came, they were actually, she and her comrades were evacuating the wounded from the Father Matthew Hall to the Richmond Hospital. And when they got back to the hall, everyone had left. But the priest was there from the nearby Capuchin church, and he got them secretly into the church, let them stay there overnight, and basically told them the next day, when everyone's at Mass, you just mix amongst the congregation and go home. And that's how she gets away. Leslie Price, and you'd have like Maura O'Neill and Lucy, Agnes Smith and Min Ryan and so on. They were told to leave the GPO on Friday, bring the wounds to Jervis Street. But they were arrested and brought to Broadstone Station, but the soldiers didn't know what to do with them. And in the case of Leslie Price, what she says is that they were all called together, held for a few hours in Broadstone, and then basically given out to by the soldiers. Again, you're young women, you shouldn't be doing this, girls aren't involved in war, so if you promise not to do anything like this again, we'll release you. And of course they say yes. Leslie Price, as soon as she's released, she runs out and she goes and tries to actually rally volunteers to make their way out to Ashbourne to Tom Ashdown, who's out there with Richard Mulcahy. So again, they're defeated in 1916, but it is only the start for these women. And you always have to keep that face of defiance, the face that you are not defeated, and the women are very, very good at that. And the girl, and she was only a girl, on your left is Dolly O'Carroll, later Dolly Lawler. And she's the girl who initiates the formation of the Colin Kill branch. and then we have Naomi Cumann, and both of these girls would have known each other because they were from the same area around Manor Street, Church Street and so on. But what they were doing in 1916, again, vital. They're bringing supplies, they're bringing ammunition, and they're bringing dispatches from mainly the Four Courts area, but out to Phibsborough, over to the Mendicity Institute, which was held by Sean Houston, and it's vital work that they're doing, but they managed to evade arrest. But 1916, again, it's only the start for these women. Brid Lyons is in the Four Courts with our cousin, Rose McGuinness, and also our uncle and our two uncles, Frank and Joe. What you have in the Four Courts, women are being sent out, they're feeding the men, and they're cooking in the kitchens and so on. Brid was sent out to assist Paddy Clancy's outpost at the bridge at Church Street there, but she recalls that they get word on the Saturday that they have to pull back, because the surrender had come. Ned Daly wanted all of his men back in the Four Courts for their safety, because he had men out in Jefferson's and Smithfield and North King Street and so on. And what he feared was that if those men are in isolated positions, if they fall into the hands of the military, then they can be killed and nothing will be known about them. So get them back into the Four Courts. She does go back, and there is this belief from everyone that the women wouldn't be arrested because, you know, they're women, what would they do with them? And the women are given the option in the Four Courts on Saturday to go home, but the priest who's there with them, he tells them that it's too dangerous. The British officer has said they'll be allowed to go home the Sunday, so look, just stay for your safety. So they stay and they sleep in the judge's robes and so on, and they wake up Sunday morning, a lorry is outside, all those women are arrested and are taken up to Richmond Barracks, and the priest is horrified. Because where they're brought to, Richmond Barracks, one of the biggest barracks in the city, it's full of men. And he was fearing for the safety of these girls. Now, they were held in the married quarters, so away from the men, but he protested that, you know, getting them out there, they couldn't be held there. And the next day, then they're brought around on 1st of May to Cumann jail, which is pretty much the same situation because it's a military prison full of men. And they were held in the West Wing, the old part, and it seemed to be depending on where you were held. Your treatment differed, because you've got some women like Josephine Kelly, I think it is, or Josephine Green, who would have fought around the Four Courts. She describes that when they wanted to use the facilities, the soldiers, there was no doors on the toilets, and the soldiers would deliberately stand there harassing the women and jeering the women. Now the result was a lot of them wouldn't use the facilities for the duration of their time there, and some of them were there for 10 days. And this had a terrible effect on their health later on. Other girls, it seems like the Inina women, where they were held, it was okay, because some girls, the Cooney sisters, they have actually okay memories, and they say the soldiers treated them okay, so it seems to be where they were held. But Brid Lyons leaves an amazing description of what it was like to be there when the executions were happening, because whereas the men are held in the newer East Wing, they're sort of held away from what's going on, the women could hear everything. And as she said, she could hear the footsteps of the soldiers coming up the stairs, and the doors opening, the doors closing, the footsteps, and then the gunshots. And they were the shots that took their leaders. But for years after, she used to wake up at that time, 4 o'clock in the morning, to that sound. So again, what happens in 16 stays with these women for the rest of their lives and has a huge impact on them. Just to talk about the Inina women. With the Inina women, the half that march off from Denora Avenue are led by this woman on your left, and that is Rose McNamara. She was the Vice OC, but in 1916 she's actually the commanding officer where these women fight, which is Maude Gonne Distillery. Now, they were to be part of Eamon Kent's command, which was the South Dublin Union, a massive, massive complex. And he'd outposts in Rose Distillery and all around James Street and so on, basically to stop the military from getting in. The women were given the option to spread out, to go to the various outposts, but these women all stayed together. Those 25 women stayed together. And like the ICA women, there's two dominant groups of women that come out in 16, and it's the Citizen Army women who march off together, surrender together, and the Inina women who march off together and surrender together. You've got women, again, so many sisters, the Cunys, the Kavanaghs, the Quigley's. You've also got the O'Keefes, and Josie is here. Josie O'Keefe is just here on your right. And again, their numbers are so depleted that they have to make do with what they have. And Maude Distillery gave a commanding view of Cork Street, of the Dry Canal, of Thomas Street, basically every advance that the British might make. And ideally you'd have a volunteer in every window overlooking, but you haven't got enough. So what they do with the women are attached to a volunteer. So in the case of Josie O'Keefe, she's with Robert Hyland, and she was his eyes, she was his ears, she was spotting for him, because he had quite a number of guns overlooking the position of the canal, but it would be this way and that way. So she's basically telling them where the soldiers are coming. And as he's firing his weapon, she's loading the guns for him. So again, this is more than making sandwiches. She's actually right there. She is his eyes and his ears. You've got Mick Liston with his two sisters there as well. And also with Rose McNamara, again, that leaves great accounts, because when the surrender does come, the men tell the women to leave, and the women refuse, because as they see it, they're comrades, they're equals, and what happens to the men will happen to the women as well. So they all march off together, march down to the Ross Road, which was their surrender point. But as they're going down the streets to Liberties, the women are singing to the men, God Save Ireland. And again, it's not letting the military know that they are defeated. And John McBride is roaring back to the women saying, keep it up, keep it up. And again, it's such a vital support, the morale that they're keeping up of these men. But as they're going down, the men are dropping the weapons, trying to get rid of them. The women are picking them up. And they actually bring them up to Richmond Barracks with them in the room. They hide them in the chimney stacks in their room, thinking that somehow they're going to get back in and retrieve those weapons. So again, it's shown that it wasn't 1916, it's only the start. But with the Cooney sisters, they were best friends with Con Colbert. In Cumann jail, again, the spirit of defiance, because their exercise period, which was walking in a circle for an hour and no talking, these women were doing Irish dancing, doing reels and jigs and stone, and the soldiers couldn't handle this, and they're told that if you don't stop, then you won't be allowed to exercise. So what they do, the next day, they go out and they obey, and they walk around the circle. As soon as they're brought back to their cells, they start to Irish dance in their cells. So it's always a spirit of defiance with these women. But they're given an option to leave Cumann on the night of the 7th of May, and they refuse. Again, they're staying together. But on the Sunday, they went to Mass, and they saw Michael Mallon, Con Colbert, Sean Houston and Eamon Kent. The next morning, the 8th of May, they hear gunshots, and they were the gunshots that took Michael Mallon, Con Colbert, Sean Houston and Eamon Kent. And that night then, the women do leave. But immediately when they leave, they start to reorganise. And you find that the women are the link between what did happen and what was to come. And if you look at, there's one lady later on, Kate Murphy, she fought alongside her husband who was captain in Marylebone Lane Distillery, but also arrested. One woman that I've just touched on, but who was so important in 1916, is Elizabeth O'Farrell, just seen here in the right in the back row. And as I said, she made her way to the GPO later on Easter Monday because she was bringing dispatches all around the country. But Elizabeth O'Farrell, when the surrender comes, it is Elizabeth O'Farrell who is chosen to actually walk out from Moore Street to go and treat with the British officer in command, General Lowe. But when we look at Friday, when the GPO is falling down around them, Pearse actually called all the women together and he thanked them for all their efforts, for all their help, but it was too dangerous, they had to leave. Now, you would think by saying that okay, they were free to go. No, the women had to actually bring the wounded from the GPO through a war zone up to Jerry Street Hospital, and any number of those women could have been killed. So although they're told to leave the GPO, they still had a job to do. But 3 women are chosen to stay behind: Winnie Carney, Julia Grennan and Elizabeth O'Farrell. And as Julia Grennan says, when they're moving from the GPO, they have to zigzag between the bullets that are flying all around the place, and they make their way to Moore Street. But of course, as we know, there is innocent civilians being killed. A family are shot by the British who have mounted the barricades all along Moore Street, and they realised, the headquarters staff realised, that the only option is to surrender. But it is Elizabeth O'Farrell who's chosen to go out and actually liaise with the British commanding officer. And not only when she does that, she then has to go to every single outpost across a war zone, often alone. Sometimes she's accompanied by a priest, and she goes to Jacob's factory, and Tomás McDonagh won't take the order because Pearse and Connolly are prisoners, and he won't actually take the order from a prisoner, so she has to go back. And it's all this to and fro, and she could have been shot at any time. Thankfully she wasn't, but she is right there in the danger zone, and she completes her task to the T, and is later then arrested and held in Cumann. Countess Markievicz, second in command to Michael Mallon in Stephen's Green, and the photograph just there on your right is actually up in Richmond Barracks after the surrender, and she's standing beside our commanding officer. And as we know, she was court-martialed like the men, and she was sentenced to death, but she wasn't executed. You have, of the 77 women that are arrested, you've got 12 that are sent to prison in England, either physically held in prison or else living in like an open prison. They're exiled, and Countess Plunkett and Kathleen Lynn would be one of them. But then you have Countess Markievicz, Nellie Gifford and Helena Maloney and so on that are actually physically held in prison, and she's the last one to be released in July 1917, but was held in Cumann jail, and like our colleagues in Cumann and the Citizen Army, she heard the gunshots that took so many of our friends. But then if you look at 1918, she's the first woman elected to the British House of Parliament. She is also the first woman appointed to the Dáil, Minister for Labour. And when you look at when she died in 1927, the people of Dublin came out and buried her. She was held in such high regard because regardless of what her background was, this woman, and like Maude Gonne, it cannot be denied, they gave everything for their country. And her funeral did show that the people of Dublin really, really held her in such high regard and respected her. Women that actually were so affected by the Rising, but not through their direct involvement, we have to talk about them, and just three in particular. On the left there we have Muriel, McDonagh and Grace Gifford sisters. Very striking photograph in the fact that Muriel is wearing black and Grace isn't, and this is taken shortly after 1916. Muriel McDonagh, the wife of Tomás McDonagh, and she never got to say goodbye to Tomás. On the night of the eve of his execution on the 2nd of May, that night word was sent to Muriel that he was going to be executed, that she was to return or go to Cumann jail to see him, but word didn't get to her in time. And by the time she made it to Cumann jail, he had a visitor, and the authorities would only let them on the first night, they'd only let them have one visitor. His sister had visited him, and she was turned away from Cumann jail. She never got to say goodbye to her husband. You fast forward a year later, shortly after this photograph was taken, Muriel herself died in a drowning accident. Grace, she married Joseph just hours before his execution on the night of the 3rd of May. And Grace's account, when they had her 10 minutes in the cell, not alone, surrounded by soldiers, and the soldier is actually holding a watch counting down to 10 minutes. But when asked what did they talk about later on, she said the two people had so much to say to each other, they actually couldn't say anything, they couldn't think of anything to say. But the reason that she is not wearing black is because there was a conscious decision made by Fiona Plunkett and Geraldine Plunkett, Joseph Plunkett's sisters, that they were not going to wear black, that it was not a time of mourning, it was a time of triumph, and these men should be remembered, and they should be seen, or this should be seen as a triumphant episode in our history. Let us not mourn their passing. And if you can imagine how that would actually look to people at that time, and as Geraldine said, or Fiona says, maybe we were a bit naive, we were only young, but they were making that statement, a very powerful statement, that they weren't defeated. The lady on your right is Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, whose husband, Francis Sheehy Skeffington, a pacifist, was murdered by, on the orders of Captain Maude Gonne in Portobello Barracks, along with 2 other journalists. And unfortunately, when the looting was going on, Francis Sheehy Skeffington decided to organise a citizens' force to try to combat the looting, but unfortunately came into the path of Maude Gonne, who was stationed in Portobello, and he was arrested. Now, Bone Coulters had actually shot a young boy around Rathmines. 2 journalists were arrested and they were taken to Portobello Barracks and they were executed on his orders for no reason. But there was a cover-up. Now, in the aftermath, she realises something has happened to her husband. He is dead, but something actually sinister has happened. And she pushes and pushes and pushes, demands to find out, and she's turned away until she comes to meet Colonel Fane, who was in Portobello, and he listened to her and he inquired. And because he was inquiring, he was then demoted. Nothing happened to Bone Coulters, but the 2 of them actually wouldn't let go, and they succeeded in getting an investigation, an inquiry, and Bone Coulters was found guilty but insane. I think he spent a year in an asylum and then he was allowed to live his life out in Canada. But if you look at her in her own right, there's a massive propaganda drive, massive publicity drive then in the months ahead in America, because the girls are sent out, and Min Ryan and so on are sent by the reorganisation of the Supreme Council of the IRB and so on. The women are sent out to get the word to America what happened in Dublin. Now, she actually meets the American president. Eamon de Valera didn't do that in his 18 months that he was there. She's only there a few months, and she actually met the American president and raised thousands of dollars and brought that back, and that money was then later used in the Dependents Fund and so on. Compensation, money used to actually help the families of the men who were either dead or who were in prison. And one woman that, you know, is instrumental in this, in reorganisation, is Kathleen Clarke, the widow of Tom Clarke. And if there is a woman who knew about the rise and what was actually going to happen, it is Kathleen Clarke. Tom Clarke, her husband, who is the brains behind the Easter Rising, she wants to take part, but he had a different role for her, which was to reorganise and to look after the families of those men who are dead or in prison. He gives her gold that she's to use to set up this fund, the National Aid Fund, but also he gives her names of men that she is to contact to reorganise the IRB, because the leadership, the 7 signatories were all the Military Council of the IRB, and that was gone. With their executions, it was gone. But the men that she is to contact are in prison, you know, they're not available. So in effect, she actually controls the IRB in that interim time, and she also does set up this dependence fund. And how the money is then given out is through Cumann. They actually go around to the houses and interview people who need to be helped, and also they have to collect money, and the people of Dublin give what they have for this fund. But if you look at Kathleen Clarke in her own right, you know, First Lady Lord Mayor of Dublin twice, again, very socially aware. She knew that, you know, there's a massive problem with unwanted pregnancies in the 40s, and even though she didn't agree with it personally, you know, being a realist, there was a whole issue of contraception, make it available. She was now defeated by everyone, but she took on the church, she took on the politicians, she took on Dublin City Council. She wasn't afraid to stand up like our comrades. If they saw something was wrong, they weren't afraid to stand up and try to change what was happening. This photograph here is absolutely amazing, because this is just the tip of the iceberg of the women that were involved in 1916. You've got 68 women here who were involved in actually collecting and distributing the funds from the Irish National Aid Fund, and it was taken in the summer of 1916 in Eilis O'Carroll's house. Now in that photograph, front row you've got Madeleine French Mullen, you've got Kathleen Lynn, and then you've got Josie McGowan, you've got Rosie Hackett, Bridget Davis, Josie O'Keefe, Elizabeth O'Farrell, Marcella Cosgrove, and just one interesting one, just this lady here, the fourth on the left, she's wearing the big coat. That's Kate Murphy, who I mentioned earlier on, who fought with her husband in Marbone Lane. And the reason she's wearing the big heavy coat is because she's heavily pregnant at the time. And she was actually pregnant at the time she was in Marbone Lane Distillery. And that's another aspect of it, how many women were actually pregnant. I was amazed at how many women were pregnant at the time and let their husbands go out, not knowing if they were going to come back. And unfortunately, in the case of Agnes Mallon and Kathleen Clarke, she was pregnant at the time and didn't tell Tom, and she lost her husband, her brother and our baby within a couple of weeks of each other. So you have that personal loss as well, that affected these women greatly, but they continued on. But these women are literally the beginning of what was to come. And when you look at what happens within a couple of months, you've got scenes like this, because we do know the stories of when the volunteers are being marched down to the docks to be shipped out to Stafford and all the internment camps and so on, that the people are throwing things at them and jeering at them, but then within 6 months, 12 months, you have scenes like this, and there's not an angry face amongst that crowd. The people are there to welcome home these men and women. They're coming back as heroes, and who did that were the women who fought in 16 and who became involved in the aftermath. And where you have the official version coming from the British government, there is another version coming from the Republican movement. And the British government made massive mistakes after 1916. One obviously was the executions of the leaders, but the other one was they underestimated the women, because when they were arrested, then before they are released, they're told to go home, do what women do, don't become involved in this. The women say yes, they mean a completely different thing, because as soon as they were released, they hit the ground running, and they started to show the Irish people that these men, it wasn't a name, that was a husband, that was a son, that was a father, that was a person, it was an honourable person. They had ideals, they loved their country. And the propaganda war begins, but the government were no match for the women, because you have the Irish Bulletin being printed every week by the women. Now it's Desmond Fitzgerald and Nursing Childers are in charge of it, but in the War of Independence, again, no issue was ever stopped, but like Kathleen McKenna and so on, she prints it in her home, and they smuggle out these newspapers every week, and not one is ever stopped, not one issue is ever stopped. And they become so good at propaganda that when it comes to the Civil War, because they can actually change the minds of the people, that the new government, they realise that they are very good, because they use those tactics with them together in the War of Independence. However, they can use them now against the new Irish government. And you find in early 23, whereas you've got thousands of men being arrested, anti-treaty IRA being arrested for what they do in raids and so on, there is an amendment made to the Special Powers Act, or the Emergency Powers Act, where you can now be arrested not for what you actually do, but for the threat of what you might do. And then that's when you find the women being arrested in their droves. And one example is Mary McSweeney. She was the sister of Terence McSweeney, who died in hunger strike in 1920. But she had been in prison in 1922-23, but she was released. However, by the time she was released, Liam Lynch, who was actually OC of the anti-treaty forces, he died, and it was his funeral, and she was making her way back down to Cork. And the Free State forces, or the government, knew that if she went down to that funeral, she could use it as a platform. So she's rearrested before she actually gets to the funeral. It's not for the fact that she's done anything, it's for what she actually might do. And I suppose talks like this, or what I'd like to sort of highlight with the books and stuff, is that the women were a vital part of the Irish Revolution, but not just from 16 to 23. These women continue to be involved, although they're sort of ostracised from big politics. Unfortunately, in the new state, they are the losers. But these women are realists, and they continue to make a difference in their communities. Like, how many children did Elizabeth O'Farrell bring into this world? How many kids did Kathleen Lynn and all of these women save with the formation of St. Dulcin's Hospital? How many women raised families and got children educated and were involved in their local community boards? They made a difference on the ground, but that's where they started, on the ground, working amongst their communities, and that social conscience never ever left them. And I suppose as an Irish person, and not as an Irish woman, as an Irish person, I just think man, woman, child, we should all be so proud of these women, an amazing generation, but these women not only being politically active, but also having that sense of social awareness that we can all make a difference, no matter how small, and even if it is making a very small sandwich, that sandwich will make a difference to someone. So on that note, I would say thank you very much.